Hello. It's a real pleasure to be here at TypeScript Congress, talking about making magic, building a TypeScript-First framework. My name is Daniel Rowe. I'm an open source library author and maintainer of Nuxt, which is a framework for building web applications. I'm also involved in some other things, from Fontaine, which helps reduce cumulative layout shift with custom web fonts, to Magic Regular Expressions, which is a reimagination of what regex could be like, based heavily on TypeScript magic, to Elk, which is a client for Mastodon, a distributed social network. I'm also a Google GDE and a Microsoft MVP. And you can get in touch with me on my website at row.dev. If there's anything that I can help you with, I would love to. I'm accessible if you have questions or you need help or you want to contribute to open source. For whatever reason, it would be really nice to say hi. I live in the UK, in the northeast of England, in a lovely rural setting by the banks of a river, in the shadow of an ancient forest. I have 3 cats and a dog. And this is where I am right now. And probably when you get in contact or send me a message, you'll find me in this exact kind of situation. It's been raining a little bit today, but it's also sunny. So that's a pretty good indication of UK weather if you're not familiar with it. And you're probably wondering, what is Nuxt if you haven't come across it before? It's a progressive framework built on Vue.js. Vue is the rendering layer, so for the front end. But it's full stack. So it also has a server engine called Nitro, which is now a framework of its own and used by other meta frameworks as well. One of the key things for Nuxt is the developer experience. So it's all about making something that is easy to use, that has best practices built in, but doesn't impose a high barrier to entry, but at the same time is configurable and allows you to extend it as you need. As you grow and have different requirements, it should grow with you. A few years ago, we started to rebuild Nuxt. And one of the things that we worked on, that we wanted to do, was think about how we could make Nuxt even more magical. And I think magic is a really important characteristic of a framework that I would want to use. I know sometimes it can be used in a pejorative sense, but I think magic is something that we want in terms of developer experience. And for me, it's really these two qualities. It's about reducing friction, keeping you in a single context, and about reducing distraction. So adopting a more minimalistic principle. So wherever you switch context, if you're a developer and you're writing code, ideas are flowing through you and out. If there's something that stops you from that, whether that's you have to go to the documentation to find out something, or you need to check in another part of your project to understand whether you can do what you're trying to do, that is going to slow you down and create a feeling of frustration. And the same is true, I think, with distraction. So when you find yourself having to maintain complex bundler configuration or to repeat code over and over again, even when you open a new component and you see 20 lines of imports at the top before you even see the code that you want to look at, all of that, I think, can get in the way of flow state, something that makes you feel productive and to enjoy and flourish in what you're doing. And so I think magic is one of the things that we can provide as framework authors that can dramatically improve the experience of developers. So when we came, as I was saying, to rebuild Nuxt from the ground up, for us, it was about thinking, how can we use TypeScript to make this kind of magic? Because building the framework, writing it in TypeScript is pretty much table stakes. But what could we do if we aimed to have TypeScript built in at a much more core level, for the framework itself to be TypeScript-native? And I came up with these 4 different possibilities, and you might have others, and more might occur to me later, but I thought these would be a helpful guide to go through. And the first is that it has to be designed to be the source of truth in a project. The framework needs to be designed for inference, so it takes best advantage of TypeScript to do what it can do. It needs to be designed for augmentation, and it needs to be designed to reveal all of the truth of the project as much as possible to the end user. So what do I mean? First, designed as a source of truth. So the moment you clone a new project in any framework, often you'll find that there's a page in the documentation called Using with TypeScript. And in this page, there's then a tsconfig. And you can go to the page and copy and paste it into your project, or maybe you have a template where it's already there. And from that moment on, your TypeScript config starts to diverge from the reality of the library. You might change it a little bit here, change it a little bit there, or maybe the library adds a new feature. And I think it's really important to think, what is the source of truth for the project? So, for example, it's possible to configure paths in your tsconfig, aliases, effectively. And it's really important they match the actual values that your bundler understands. And there are different approaches for this kind of thing, ensuring that there's a single source of truth. And so some frameworks, Vite, for example, will read your TypeScript config and try and respect what's there. But we've adopted a different approach with Nuxt. Our aim is for Nuxt to be the source of truth, and we generate a tsconfig that reflects that truth. So you can customize aliases in your Nuxt config. That's important because we need to know about them. It also means we can expose them to module integrations. And then we generate a tsconfig that has the right path configuration. Because we understand subpath export conditions, we can set the bundler configuration, the module resolution, to bundler. Because we support importing JSON files, we can say that that's allowed as well. And so it makes sense for us to be in charge of that, I think. I also think, and this is not something that we actually did as Nuxt, more one that we benefited from, but there was a Vue initiative started by Johnson called Volar. And it's a fantastic editor integration for VS Code. At least that's how it started, enabling TypeScript to understand Vue single file components, which look a little bit more like HTML than TypeScript. But it basically wraps them and transforms them and makes TypeScript understand this. But Volar was built in such a way. It's now cross framework, so it's not just Vue. And it's also cross IDE, so it's not just VS Code. And it's built in such a way that it wraps TypeScript so you can even run it from the command line, which means that everything that we've tried to do in such a way that it is not specific to a single editor. So it's not VS Code specific, it's TypeScript specific, which means that we are able, so JetBrains, for example, now uses Volar. But even if they didn't, it would be possible just using Vue TSC on the command line to get full type support for every feature that we build. And I think that's a better approach in general than creating, for example, a plugin that does some magic specifically in an IDE. So wherever possible, we've tried to use things like define functions that provide types rather than rely on a magical plugin that just gives hints in your editor. But it's not just about setting the source of truth. That's pretty much the start. We've tried as much as possible to use the power of TypeScript for the things it's good at, such as inference. So rather than writing lots and lots of files to disk with lots of information, as much as possible, we just want to connect TypeScript and the user's code. So here are two examples. First, end-to-end type safety. So in Nuxt 2, we had the ability to have server endpoints with a sort of a node express connect style pattern. So you could access the node request and response objects. You could call functions like resEnd. You could pass a string, and that's going to be sent back to the end, to the user who's consuming it. But of course, they have no type safety for that. How could they? Unless you create a custom client, maybe you're using something like TRPC, there would be no way to type this. And we thought for Nuxt 3, we actually have full control of this. We have control of the server endpoint. It's in your project. We also have control of the the sort of the fetcher function that's going to fetch from it. So we can actually provide types. So we did this. We moved the signature to one which doesn't just call a method like resEnd, to one that actually directly returns the value that the JSON value that it returns. We also support other things like returning a stream or a buffer or things like that, or null to return a 204 response. And there are a lot of other features and reasons why we've built it this way. But one of them is that it really enables very nice inference. So we can simply say, for example, to TypeScript, this key, like this path API test, corresponds to this file and its return type. That's all we need to do. Then we provide a wrapper around fetch, which is nice in other ways. So it automatically parses JSON, for example. But it also can provide types. And so we can type hint the possible routes in your app, and you can select it. And we can also provide you the actual types of those as the response. Not because we've done any hard work at our end to generate those types, but simply because we've connected TypeScript and the endpoint. You don't even have to do any work as a user. You don't have to create a client or a wrapper or call some special function. It's just a normal web standard fetch, and you get type safety for it. Another example, in Nuxt 2, we had a common provide inject pattern where you might do something like add a global singleton in your app. So maybe an auth helper. And we had this pattern where you could call an inject function and pass in something that then gets injected into your app. And then you could use it. But of course, the moment types come into it, it's not going to work, because what you ideally want to do is have type safe access to this helper. And it's up to you as user to create the types for that and create an augmentation. And actually, as a framework, we don't want users to have to write types. We don't want them to have to write augmentations. So we were able to use, again, inference. So the same kind of pattern where we have a define function and a return type. And doing this, either having a function or an object with functions within it, like this inference pattern works really well. Because all we need to do, again, it's a little bit more complex than the API, but we just have to point the file to some types that do some massaging of the data, and that's all we need to do. Then you have type-safe access to all of your injections. And so as the user creates more plugins, the only thing we have to do is add them to a list rather than do any kind of transformation or anything like that. So we take advantage of inference where we can to make best use of TypeScript's power, but then we also design specifically for augmentation. And as I said before, this is really core to Nuxt's philosophy. We want to be extensible. It's one of the things that makes us, I think, unique. It's the community and the ecosystem that have come around it. But it really has meant that we do have to build Nuxt in a way that can be extended. So we have Nuxt modules, which are integrations. We have hundreds and hundreds of them. Some created, some core modules, but most community maintained, some private within agencies and companies that use Nuxt. And they are everything from integrations with CMSs to authentication to data fetching to caching to very customized and specific modules. You can see some of them at nuxt.com/modules. And users can do the same kind of things. So what does it look like to let users and module authors customize and control the types and the type environment of a project? So we have a couple of things that we've made available. So it's possible for module authors to add their own templates into the Nuxt build. And we also enable them to add type templates specifically for augmenting some of the types that Nuxt provides or even their own. They are fully asynchronous. They can be defined at runtime and modified at runtime based on what the user is doing. So if you're in development building something and you create one file or change the module options, it might change what the module decides to do. This particular type template would automatically be registered in the app context. So it would write this file to disk and then add it to the tsconfig references. And it would define that there's another field on your root metadata that you can set in the define page meta helper, and you can access in useRoot.meta if you're interested. But the point is that it's simple for module authors to do. And in fact, everything else about the type configuration setup is also accessible. So whether that is the specifics of the tsconfig that we generate, or references and declarations that we actually inject through a custom nuxt.d.ts file, it's all available, which means there's almost no type customization that's impossible to do from a module point of view. So hopefully that gives enough infrastructure for extensibility on the type front. But then there's really the most important bit, which is that we then need to expose the reality, like the fundamental reality of what Nuxt is and how the bundler works to the user in their IDE developing the app. And of course, at the type checking stage as well, that goes without saying. So I thought I'd just do a little demo of what that might look like. So this is a Nuxt app I've started. It's just very basic. I'm running a dev server in the background, I think. And you'll see, of course, we have this tsconfig. This is just a cloned, fresh project. And this tsconfig actually references another tsconfig. This one is generated by Nuxt here. And it has lots of information. So these are the aliases that are available. And we generate some include and exclude patterns as well. And so then in your app, that means you don't really need to configure anything. So out of the box, you get something like, you get types of safety for components that are available to you to be auto-imported. So in this case, Nuxt welcome is a component. You get type safe access to its props. If you create your own component, you would have exactly the same thing there too. So if I created a myComponent.view and I gave it, say, some props, I'll use this is a view syntax for defining props at the type level. I would do something like custom prop string. And then I could actually go ahead and use this in my app. So I'm going to be able to actually access my component directly. It exists. It's going to throw me a type error because it actually needs to have custom prop provided. And that actually has to be a string. So I actually have to give it a value. And so I have type safety. I can actually click to go to the component. I also have other kinds of things. Oops, lang as ts. That I can actually access in the script. So for example, if I were to create a server endpoint, like the one I just demoed, then I would be able to do something like this, foo bar, and that is then going to be directly accessible here. I'll get type safe access to the actual list of roots in my app, and I'll get access to the data that comes back. In this case, you could access that endpoint with a post method as well. I haven't specified. But if I did restrict it, say something like this can only be accessed via a get method, then actually TypeScript is going to throw me an error here as well and say that it has to be a get method. So there are a lot of ways we can bring type safety this way in the app. If I were to do something like create a layouts folder and create a custom layout, something like this, and I might also do something, we have a concept of middleware that controls whether or not you can access a particular route or whether you might be redirected somewhere else instead. Both of these are type safe from the user's point of view. So if I were to enable routing in the app, which is done just by creating a pages directory. And then I wanted to use the layout and the middleware in my page. I would actually at this point have type safe access. So I would know that the layout has got to be actually custom is the only option there for me. And if I want to pick a middleware, well, again, I have type safe access. It's got to be an auth middleware, which again is a really useful thing, because it means that if I later go and rename one of those things, I'm going to get a warning or an error when I try and build the app. There's more. So from a Nuxt perspective, the way that we consume environment variables is through something called runtime config. We don't want to pass everything in at runtime. We want to be very specific about what continues to be changeable at runtime. So in this case, I've set a GitHub token. That's going to be accessible. Well, to start with, we are able to generate a little hint which says that this is actually overridable with this environment variable. So if you create a .env file with that value, then that is going to define what it is going to be at runtime. So that's a useful thing, maybe for DX for users. If I then go and try and use that in the app, so something like use runtime config, then I actually get type safe access to the fact that I have GitHub and token, which is, again, quite a useful thing to be able to have. And it effectively means that I get type safe access to my environment without needing to add any additional validation. Nuxt does it for me. We also have other things like we have an app config, for example. This is used for things like reactive but build time configuration. So I might say something like, I'll stick a theme. And there are actually a lot of different sources for app config. You might have a module which adds something, or you might have a theme layer that you've created. And I'll just try and replicate that by doing something in a Nuxt config file and also in this app config file. We use just a basic type to merge that and actually deduplicate and remove undefined values based on the different app configs that are provided. And so you would also have access to something like that, where you would actually be able to access the theme, and maybe I haven't saved it yet. And you would have the same access in your Nuxt config as well. So the foo.bar would be able to come through as well. Where is this? So I should be able to have access to that as well. There's a lot more, so much more that we could have. But one thing I do want to highlight, because it's an interesting pattern and we're still working on this, but we have a separate tsconfig for our server folder because it's actually a separate environment. So some things are part of the view part of your application. That's most of your Nuxt app. That's the front end bit. So we have things like refs. So this is a reactive value and it's going to be tracked. Its reactivity is going to be tracked. It's going to trigger re-renders. But actually, we don't make this auto import available in the server routes because the server routes are not really running in a view context. So by having this additional tsconfig, we're able to tell the IDE that this directory has a different set of things, a different set of auto imports. So we're actually able to give the user a better developer experience because they know what things can be used where. And I think there are a lot more things like that that we can unpack and make available as time goes on. Well, there is so much more that I would love to show you, but I'm afraid I don't really have time now, and there's so many good talks yet to come. But if you are interested at all in any of what I've shown you, do check out nuxt.com. There's some documentation there and a getting started guide. You can follow Nuxt on Twitter, or X, as I think it's starting to be called, or Mastodon. And we have a Discord server that is pretty active, and I'll definitely see it if you ask a question there. But do get in contact with me if you've got any questions or there's anything I can do to help you get started with Nuxt, or if you have got an idea or a suggestion for how to make things better. I would also love to hear from you. That's pretty much it from me, but it's been a real pleasure to be here talking to you, and I hope you've enjoyed the conference as much as I have so far. All the best.